As we get started, I want to first just thank everybody for coming. I hope everybody is staying warm on this day. I'm Chris Kuschel. I'm a principal planner at MAPC. And I just wanted to start by introducing our executive director, Mark Drayson. Mark, if you want to say a few words, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chris. I really appreciate it. I should start by noting this is one of those very, very few occasions when Chris is wearing a tie and I am not. I hope he'll forgive me for that. I'm terribly proud of the work that Chris and other members of the team in the land use department, in the data services department, and also in communications have done on this report, and really longer term, the work we've been doing on reimagining suburban communities, reimagining and retrofitting suburban strip malls, and trying to figure out what suburban communities look like in the future. There is, often a friendly tension between cities and suburbs, but in reality, I believe that they often face many of the same stresses from the marketplace and from changes in our society. Right now, everybody is undergoing a complete transformation of land use and transportation priorities and practices as we deal with the pandemic, the recession that we're just coming through, and an uncertain future. And I'm very proud of the fact that we have taken a look at this really set of real estate opportunities that exist in retail malls in our suburban communities, and even in a few of our more urban communities that are outside of the immediate inner core. And we've seen that often there are vacancies, often there is a lack of traffic, often there is a lack of patronage. And yet we also see some that have reimagined themselves and provide us with some keys for what the future might be like. Very often, not always, but very often that involves a mix of uses that is not traditional in our suburbs, but which is increasingly demanded by patrons and by the market. And our goal at MAPC is to use the research we've done to try and guide redevelopment in the future in ways that will be responsive, that will promote equity, that will be sustainable from a climate perspective. And I think all of that is to the good. It points to a brave future for these spaces, and I think a brave future for the communities that depend upon them. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Chris. Thank you all for participating, and particularly the panelists, as well as the members of my staff. We're looking really forward to this work being put to use over the months and years ahead.
Thanks so much, Mark. And I would just say, I think this is the first time I've put on a tie in the last 2 years. So we have a couple of great speakers to kick things off, and we're excited to release our research, which we're now calling Rethinking the Retail Strip. This research, it's part of our recently adopted long-range regional plan, which I think many of you are familiar with, called Metro Common 2050. This plan, it provides an actionable roadmap to creating a more equitable and sustainable region. And when we started this planning process several years ago, we had asked residents and workers what they wanted their future to look like and what tools they needed to help achieve that vision. And we heard everything from creating safe and walkable neighborhoods, getting around in ways that reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, providing more housing and more affordable housing, and having greater economic stability. And I think today we're focusing on a topic that touches on all of these aspects, and it looks at how redevelopment opportunities of strip malls and similar retail properties can actually be a powerful tool to help achieve our goals. Before we go further, I do want to take this opportunity to acknowledge just some of the people who have really helped contribute to this work. Tim Reardon, our Director of Data Services. Tim has really helped guide this project from what was a fairly rough initial idea and helped shape it into this final product. Caitlin Spence, who did all of the amazing modeling and analytical work. Jesse Partridge Guerrero, who has provided just invaluable input and work throughout the process, and Ryan Kelly and Kimberly Nugent, who created the website and the interactive tools that I'll show you in a bit. But I first want to introduce June Williamson. June and her colleague, Ellen Dunham-Jones, they literally wrote the book on retrofitting suburbia. And they have a new book out called Case Studies in Retrofitting Suburbia, which I highly recommend. Several years ago, my colleague Karina and we had invited June to speak at MAPC on this topic. And that was actually the spark that initiated all of this work. And I think it's great that June's back today, and I sort of feel like it brings it full circle. So June, I'll hand it to you.
Thank you so much, Chris. I'll be sharing the screen here. All right, there we go. Hello, I am so pleased to be here to support MAPC as a native Bostonian. I live in New York City now, but I'm from Boston, and an ardent advocate for the transformation or retrofitting of the unsustainable and non-resilient, sprawling, inefficient, and increasingly obsolete suburbanized landscapes of Northern America. So we advocate that places like this can be like this or this. My most recent book came out last year, Case Studies in Retrofitting Suburbia, as Chris mentioned, co-authored with my longtime colleague, Ellen Dunham-Jones. Through decades of careful study of the deep and rich history of suburbanization, the ideals and design visions, the policies and politics, the economic and social forces, as well as the collection of many case study examples, we've proposed a framework about how processes of retrofitting individual suburban sites, pieces of actual property, real estate, may add up over time incrementally to reshape the metropolitan areas of Northern America. So suburban retrofitting then is a long-term 50-year project for remaking the metropolis into a more sustainable and resilient, multi-centered urban structure through systemic transformation of large, prototypical single-use suburban sites, including vacant and obsolete shopping malls, big box stores, office parks, and the like. And we argue that there are 6 urgent challenges for raising the bar on the next generation of suburban retrofits. And I'm just quickly going to explain and illustrate each one. So first, disrupt auto dependence. Where possible, retrofit for a compact, dynamic mix of uses so people can park once and do multiple things or not drive at all. So retrofits must be designed with real, complete streets with equal priority for walkers, bikers, transit riders, and freight delivery, as well as regular drivers. Freight by truck, van, or in a robot, as in this example from the UK. And of course, it's important to improve and expand mass transit options. How do we do this? Partly by removing excess asphalt or depaving. So we can build on gray fields and parking lots to enhance the public realm and support walking. In this case, an active green park replaced a truck loading facility. Second challenge is to improve public health. Solid research shows that physical design can support and encourage healthy physical activity, which is vital in the face of the epidemic levels of obesity and chronic disease, such as diabetes in this country. And that's a kind of longer term health crisis, which are correlated with sedentary lifestyles. So retrofit projects can bank on this knowledge and can also make the built environment safer from preventable injuries and from crime, address mental wellness with biophilia type designs, and others to combat loneliness, and to reduce exposure to polluted air, soil, and water. So this next example is a pilot project that sought to implement the research linking design to increased levels of healthy physical activity in people's everyday lives. So this 2-block long retrofitted street is also more complete, accommodating pedestrians, as you can see on the right, as well as their best friends. And in Arlington, Virginia, a former big box grocery store, as you can see in the upper middle, was demolished for the 5-story Arlington Mill Community Center. There's a full array of healthy programming for older adults and teens. And you can see in the middle there, the basketball/pickleball court. It's next to a linear creekside park. This is along Columbia Pike. It's the whole kind of retrofitted corridor or strip. And the neighborhood's very diverse, as are many suburban areas. The residents are two-thirds non-white and 40% foreign-born. And the rear part of the site contains a 122-unit affordable housing, 100% affordable housing building with 12 barrier-free units. And I think this example illustrates the potential of MAPC's research that we're going to see more of a little bit later. A third challenge is to support an aging population. By 2050, it's projected that a larger percentage of the US population will be older. The share of folks over 65 is expected to grow to 20%. And as a result, there will be even more 1- and 2-person households as people long outlived their child rearing years. So how can we address this challenge? Some of the tactics include embracing lifelong communities planning models that support needs and desires of residents of all ages. And we can retrofit the existing places where people already live so that they can age in community with senior care amenities that they can walk to. This case study, Promenade at Wayzata, is a redevelopment type retrofit of a small shopping mall. So you see here a transformation from standalone retail boxes on a field of asphalt that was built on filled wetlands to a cluster of perimeter mixed-use block buildings with green roofs and a great lawn for gathering and performances. All the parking in this case is below grade. It's also quite complex for managing stormwater. And this project includes a 326-unit continuing care retirement community with independent living units and memory care support. So you see a real kind of socially oriented retrofit here. The next challenge is to leverage social capital for equity. So we know by now that suburbs are not homogeneously the same socioeconomically. However, they can be highly fragmented and segregated places. We see this in Boston for sure. They've been systemically structured that way, and these structures are very entrenched in governance, zoning, and so on. So social capital's networks of civic trust and social cohesion among people in societies provide pathways to increase individual happiness and well-being and access to economic opportunity, in other words, social infrastructure. So how can retrofits raise the bar on this challenge? In re-inhabitation type retrofits, that's reuse of existing buildings, of commercial spaces, locally owned businesses can flourish, building economic resilience. In redevelopment type retrofits, we can add and preserve housing affordability and choice by adding new units. And in regreening type retrofits, we can provide equitable access to new public spaces and an enhanced civic realm, as in this example from Wyandanch on Long Island, where you see this skating rink and plaza in what was formerly a large commuter parking lot. So that example, Wyandanch Rising in Suffolk County, it's an ambitious retrofit and regreening, redevelopment and regreening retrofit, decades in the making. In 2000, the hamlet so it's a kind of unincorporated hamlet of Wyandanch was named Long Island's most economically distressed community. And over a lengthy process, it's being rebuilt with mixed-use affordable housing around that civic green with the ice skating rink, on cleaned up brownfields and former parking lots next to a commuter station. And it features new local retail, job training, and a co-working space focused on BIPOC-owned digital startups. Fifth challenge, and I'm just giving you like one or two examples of each challenge, is to compete for jobs. So now let's consider the newest people entering the workforce. How can suburban locations compete? Old office parks and corporate campuses can be retrofitted to retain these workers by pursuing urbanism itself as an amenity to attract employers, such as at Domain in Austin, Texas. And here you see these before and after sort of future, before and future diagrams showing all of the infill and redevelopment in this former kind of industrial office park area outside Austin. And this example also in Austin, it's a community college took over a dying mall, which is in the cyan and the blue on the right, and to use it as classrooms and a kind of satellite campus. And then transit's been added, parking structures allow where the perimeter parking lots all around to be infilled with housing that is apartments that the students can rent, and office and commercial use. So you can see that in the yellow and orange red on the right. So kind of filling in all the way around. And then the final challenge is to add water and energy resilience. So to introduce green, soft infrastructure in place of gray, hard infrastructure, we get back to those parking lots again, for managing stormwater, as in this image. This is when it's just built, so you can kind of see clearly the bioswales and rain gardens in this cottage court project in Rhode Island. And there's a whole array of other best practices that I won't spell out. And then another example, in the downtown of working class Meriden, Connecticut, a stream was culverted decades ago in the urban renewal era, and the Hub Mall, which you see on the upper left, was built over it. The site flooded frequently. There just wasn't enough room in that culvert for the floodwater, the stormwater, and you can see one of those storm images on the lower left. So it was all demolished. The creek was daylit, and the site regraded and regreened as a stormwater park to be surrounded with new affordable apartments on higher ground, and all the area around it's better protected now that this site is a stormwater park. So in conclusion, here are the 6 challenges to summarize. And a reminder, the majority of Northern Americans already live in suburbs and suburbanized areas and have done so for some time. So these places in all their varied forms are the dominant urban experience in this nation. And as more malls, office parks, and other grayfield sites age, they provide opportunities to redevelop, re-inhabit, and regreen suburbia in more community serving ways. And this new book includes 32 in-depth case studies from across the continent. And to learn more, please visit retrofittingsuburbia.com. And with that, I will stop.
Thanks so much, Tina. That was great. I think a really great way to frame this whole topic for us. So thanks for that. So our next speaker I'd like to introduce is David Gillespie, who is Vice President of Development at Avalon. And David, he's going to talk about a local project that I think makes a nice case study for this very subject. And that's the redevelopment of what used to be the Woburn Mall. And I just want to note before handing it off, this project had a lot of stakeholders, including the city of Woburn under the leadership of Mayor Galvin and his planning director, Tina Cassidy. There were 2 developers plus their team of architects and attorneys. MAPC was involved as a consultant to the city, and DHCD, as this zoning for this project was done under the Chapter 40R Smart Growth Overlay District. So David, I'll hand it off to you.
Great, thanks very much, Chris. And I'm just going to share my screen here. Everyone can see that. So just going to give a quick overview of the Woburn Mall project and really talk about densification opportunities in the suburbs in general. You know, the Woburn Mall was a mall project, but we have successfully executed these types of projects in also office parks, parking lots next to redeveloped mills. And as a strategy, we like to build housing in these areas because you know the residents don't have to drive to everything. And to bring housing closer to existing services, it's not only a benefit for all the reasons that June mentioned, but also as a benefit for the people that live there. And for town officials that are thinking about this, it does give you a housing choice in your town that you may not have otherwise. If you're predominantly single-family detached housing, this gives a place people could move that has an elevator, that has services, that's walkable, where they want to stay in your town, but they don't necessarily have an option. And I think this provides a nice opportunity to do that. We've successfully built these types of projects in different forms and fashions in Sudbury, North Andover, Marlborough, Easton, and Saugus. So it is a strategy that a lot of municipalities are using successfully throughout the Commonwealth. First, I'll just give a quick overview of this site. It's right by the intersection of 93 and 95. There are two commuter rail stations within close distance, and this is the site in the middle. Obviously, a very transit-oriented, high-traffic site. This is the original aerial of the Woburn Mall. It's an enclosed mall. It had a market basket on one end and a hallway in the center. This project was purchased by our partner, development partner, Edens. They was a retail partner, and we were the residential partner as it related to this project. And I think one thing that really can't be understated in this type of development is the two biggest hurdles. One being obviously permitting and creating a shared vision with the city or the municipality you're working with, also with DHCD and MAPC and everyone else that's working on it. And then also the tenant consents. That's one thing that I learned along the way is several of these tenants who have long-term leases have a significant amount of control about the redevelopment of the site. So as you start to look at these, we can all drive by a mall and see a big parking lot and say, wow, wouldn't that be great if we could build housing there and everyone could walk to the location that they want to. But the truth is that the tenants do have a lot of control, and you need to properly investigate that before you go too far down the path on any one particular site. This is just some photos of the original mall that really project that was driven by Edens and the city of Woburn, MAPC, DHCD, and then Avalon joined to create the housing piece. Some existing photos of what it was like beforehand. Obviously, a site that was ready for redevelopment. And this was the initial site plan, the initial vision for the site. As you can see, there were some new boxes built here for TJ Maxx, HomeSense, DSW. Market Basket isn't shown here, it's off to the right. Market Basket was the only tenant that stayed as it related to this community. And the original vision had several boxes out here. Actually, I take that back. Colonial, some of these tenants here in this box also stayed. But there were four other out parcel buildings built. And then this was originally planned to be a cinema with two restaurants integrated into it. Obviously, through COVID, the world has changed a bit on the cinema front. And that was retrofitted through permitting into a park. This is the current site plan. So as you can see, Market Basket stayed, and a lot of the existing tenants were included in this bar building here. And then a number of out parcel buildings were built freestanding for an array of restaurant and lifestyle tenants. We then built 350 homes in a 5-story apartment building, which has 13,000 feet of retail on the ground floor within a precast parking garage. And you'll be able to see a photo of it in a second, but there's 2 enclosed courtyards, 10,000 square feet of amenities. And also this was permitted through 40R, so it's 25% affordable, for which all the units count to the subsidized housing inventory for the city of Woburn. This is an aerial of where we are today. Just to give a quick timeline, Edens is very quick in the sense of how these projects go. Eden's purchased the mall in the summer of 2017, and we started construction 2 years later. And that included all the master planning, all the permitting to start construction. And we've delivered the first apartments the summer of 2021, and we'll be done by the summer of 2022. So this project, start to finish was very fast for a project of this scale. It's over 200,000 square feet of retail and 350 apartment homes. So as you can see, we're well underway. In front of you, you'll see these are the last two restaurant buildings that are being built. And then this is the location that will eventually be a new public outdoor space, which was formerly going to be a cinema. So I think that's a big win for our residents as well as for the city of Woburn. A few other photos. This is some photos of some of the new retail buildings that Eden's built. So a refurbished Panera. And then, using a common design vision for the site. That was another thing that MAPC helped us a lot out with, is to make sure that all of these parts and pieces stitched together and felt like a cohesive architectural vision for the entire site. So this is another picture that shows, even if you are doing, larger boxes for TJ Maxx and Home Goods, you can integrate them into your design vision that make it feel like it's all part of one place. And finally, this is the last rendered image. This is what the eventual park will be looking like when they complete it, hopefully this year. And that's it for me, Chris. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David. And I just want to note, I think maybe looking at that site plan, some people might comment about there's still a lot of parking on that east side of your site, certainly, but that reflects the notion, or the what you noted about the long-term tenants, that you essentially have to keep that parking for the market basket and for the TJ Maxx that's there. But thank you very much for that. Sasha, I think you're going to share the presentation on your screen, since I was having some technical difficulties. Thank you. I also want to note, I know people are putting comments in the chat, and we're going to address those at the end. Tim is going to facilitate the Q&A. And so if you do have a question, please feel free to put those into the chat. So we're going to get into MAPC's research now, and which this falls within this framework of what June described of retrofitting suburbia. And when June came to speak to us a few years ago, there were two things that struck me. First was that a lot of our work, this subject, it's baked into it, but we hadn't really looked at it explicitly. And two, a lot of the work from what I've seen that's been done, it focuses on specific projects and design, which I love personally. But I thought that we had this opportunity to take a real strong analytical approach to the subject and apply our policy lens. So next slide. I guess I can do it myself. Thanks, Sasha. So first question is, well, among the various suburban forms that we have, why are we focused on strip malls? And I'm using that term kind of loosely defined for all sort of auto-centric retail sites, but why them among the various suburban forms that we have? And the answer is that there's a few reasons. One is they're everywhere. Our research has shown that the median amount of area per town or in city within the MAPC region is 71 acres of land devoted to strip malls. By a number of measures, they're often underutilized. Maybe related to that, their future is cloudy. There's, I think, a number of systemic changes that have changed the retail landscape. And then finally is they tend to be able to be developed in a more near-term fashion than some of these other suburban forms, such as an office park, or if you think about how Assembly Road took a couple of decades of planning. And I think what David had noted, from the purchase by Eden's to now it's almost done with construction, only several years. The sites, they tend to be small sites. The Woburn Village is certainly on the upper end of the scale, I'd say, but they also tend to be clustered together. And so that can allow for the sites to be developed incrementally to help create a neighborhood. Sasha, can you go? Oh, there it is. Okay. So the first part of our analysis was we wanted to understand what is the scale of the opportunity, or how much land is there. Now, for those of you who work with GIS, you probably know that there's no land use code that you can just click on to identify strip malls. So we had to use the land use parcel database and then make a number of assumptions to try and sort of capture those that we're really talking about here. And so I just want to caveat all of this, that the research, there's certainly, we probably are capturing some sites that are actually not appropriate based upon the data. And if there are mistakes, we certainly want to hear about that so we can update those. We've certainly updated some of them manually ourselves. Nevertheless, though, I think the scale from the analysis is pretty striking in my mind. We identified over 3,000 sites in the MAPC region, and that covers nearly 14 square miles of land. And since we've been on the subject of Woburn, I included as a comparison that's actually bigger than the entire city of Woburn. The second part of our analysis was to understand what is the potential for build out. We are concerned particularly with housing on this site, on these sites, and how that can help achieve a number of our goals, in particular the housing ones. And we did this in a way where we wanted to assume that this was mixed use development, because we know that there's often concerns within communities about commercial displacement. So we're essentially keeping the amount of commercial space fairly similar to what is there today. And then we tried to also do this in a nuanced way, considering that we're dealing with over 3,000 sites. So what we did was we created a set of assumptions based upon number of floors that would be allowed, how big the units would be, how much parking is required, how much open space, etc. And then we first looked at sites that are near transit stations, so within a half a mile of station areas. MAPC has categories for different types of station areas. So each of the various station areas had a set of assumptions applied to them. We then looked at the rest of the community, not within the station area. Again, MAPC has categories for different types of communities. So inner core communities, growing suburbs, mature suburbs, etc. And we had a set of assumptions for each of those. And then finally, if the site was located along a major arterial roadway, we then had another set of assumptions, with the idea there being sites along, for example, Route 1 in Saugus would have different development characteristics from those within Saugus Center. Now, we know, of course, not all sites are created equal. And so the final piece of the analysis is what we're calling a suitability analysis. And this is an attempt to try and prioritize the sites where redevelopment would best help achieve MAPC, the region's goals, in a sustainable manner. So I won't go through all the components of the model, but I'm just showing this diagram just to give a sense that all these various inputs help provide a weighted score that contribute to the overall score of a site, and so that we can relatively see which sites are best suited compared to other ones. So things that are in this model is the site near transit? If so, how many jobs are accessible by that? What's the walk score? What is the build out capacity? And then we can look at the results of the analysis. One of the things I've done here, what we've done is looked at what if we just took the top 10% most highly suitable sites. This isn't to suggest that once you go lower that those are no longer suitable. But even here, just the top 10% of sites, again, I think the results are fairly striking. Our analysis shows that you could accommodate 125,000 new homes. And again, this is part of mixed use development. If these were all done as 40 Rs, such as the way that Woburn Village was, and then that would imply approximately at least 25,000 of those homes would be deed restricted affordable. The amount of new tax revenue would be nearly $590 million from this redevelopment. And then looking at from the environmental perspective, thinking about comparing redevelopment of these sites compared to greenfield sites, 400,000 metric tons of carbon emissions could be averted. To use June Williamson's term, which I like, of depaving, we would avert 10 square miles of new impervious surface by redeveloping these existing sites. And then finally, I want to point out that almost a third of our sites are within half a mile of transit. And that's important for a lot of reasons, but in particular, given the recent legislation and requirements for the MBTA communities. So I've included a link there at the bottom of the screen. This is the link to the website that has the full report, as well as we've created 2 digital tools that I hope will be useful to a number of you. So I've taken a couple of screenshots for these. The first is an interactive map. So this map, the landing page, it starts at a view of the sub-regional site view where it shows all of our sites and provides some summary statistics of all sites. And then you can zoom in. You can zoom in on a particular community, and it provides the summary statistics for that specific community. You can continue to zoom in, and those dots turn into the actual parcel shapes of the sites. And we have the statistics and the analysis for each of those individual sites. The second data tool is a data visualization tool, and I'm here showing it. You can slice and dice this data in several ways. There's some filtering functions. Here I'm showing it by the sub-region perspective here. So we have a number of different data that we can look at for people who want to take a deeper dive into the data. And so there's 2 tabs where my cursor is. It's by the geography, or you can click on the data table itself. And we provide the analysis and the information for every single one of the 3,000 plus sites organized by community. So again, you can just scroll down to your specific community. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears now. That's a quick overview of the analysis. And now I'll just touch on more of the policy side of things. When I was talking about a suitability analysis, that doesn't take into account actually how likelihood a specific site is to be redeveloped. We know that there are a number of barriers, and the report addresses them. We bucket these barriers into 3 different buckets. The first is local barriers that might exist. Most often, this is the zoning itself. We know very often these highly suitable sites, it's actually prohibited to create mixed-use development or multifamily development. And then there are many other situations where technically mixed use might be allowed, but there are so many various restrictions and provisions that it renders it effectively impossible to redevelop. There are often infrastructure issues. This is certainly a tough nut to crack as it relates to water capacity or wastewater disposal. And then the final barrier that we touch upon is something that I think some of us as planners don't think about as often, and that's barriers related to the landowner themselves. David talked about one related to the tenants that might be existing, and depending what their covenants are, but there are others as well. Many of these sites are owned by individuals, not professional developers. They're receiving a steady income stream, and while certainly the potential for returns could be greater by having mixed-use development, that's not without risk. It's costly. It requires upfront capital. It's a complex process that they might lack the expertise to engage in that. So again, that's not an easy barrier to overcome. The website, we did do a few case studies, and one of these case studies in particular, I think, provides a nice example of how an individual who's not a professional developer was able to redevelop. And that's actually, I think, in June's hometown of Dedham. Certainly every community is different. Every site is different. But we think that there are some broad principles that can generally apply. And I'm just going to run through some of the ones that at MAPC we think are most important very quickly, and I'll just note how Woburn Village incorporated these. So the first is thinking beyond one specific site itself and thinking about the neighborhood at large. I think is really a critical. So the Woburn Village was one site, a very important site certainly, but of a larger corridor plan that MAPC was working on with the city of Woburn that had a whole number of elements. We've talked a little bit, and Mark, I think, really highlighted this at the outset about how important equity is as part of this, doing this work. Again, in Woburn Village's case, a quarter of the 350 units were affordable units. Prioritizing walkability and alternative ways of getting around. The larger corridor plan envisioned within the study area this internal connection to first get pedestrians away from the very busy commerce way that exists today, and also just helps break down what is essentially a super block today. And Woburn Village's site plan actually really helps set the stage for that by within essentially the center of their site plan providing, it's the pick on the bottom right there, a direct pedestrian connection to the properties to the north, and that actually provides direct access to hundreds of employees in the office building right to the north of it. There's also a river that runs along the study area, which, as somebody who grew up in Woburn, I never even knew there was a river there. And so our plan called for creation of a path to actually provide that as an amenity, and the developers did contribute funding towards the feasibility of creating that path in the future. One of the benefits to strip malls is that they tend to provide affordable spaces for small and local businesses. And so mitigating commercial displacement is an important equity consideration. In Woburn Village's case, there was a very small but long-running shop of a locks and keys store, and they do have a space now in the new redevelopment. The final two have to do with maximizing the actual value on the site, both for the landowner as well as for the host community. And then finally, providing a predictable and clear approval process for permitting. Those broad principles then lead into specific recommendations. And I'm not going to go through these in detail at all now, but I just wanted to highlight a few things. Here we bucketed them into local actions and state actions. Within the local actions, the zoning, again, as I mentioned, tends to be one of the most critical factors. So certainly allowing residential into the mix is one of the needs for mixed-use development, but that's probably not sufficient to make really good zoning. I think incorporating the affordability is important for the equity considerations, and also establishing clear design criteria is, I think, important. And when I say that, I'm not focused so much on the architecture in the buildings themselves, but more what are those broader urban design elements that help foster walkability. Other recommendations focus on mitigating the traffic impacts and allowing and incentivizing people to not just get around the site itself, but also how do people get to the site in ways and alternative means of transportation. For the state actions, many of these recommendations came from our MetroCommon 2050 regional plan, especially the ones that were related to facilitating more equitable transit-oriented development. We found that they were applicable to facilitating redevelopment of these types of sites as well. So the report, we summarize these different recommendations, and then we provide a link to the larger recommendations in the plan of MetroCommon 2050. So here again is the website, which is live and I think should be open to use right now. I just want to thank everyone again, and I wanted to leave some time, which I believe we do have a fair amount of time now for Q&A. So Sasha, I think you can stop sharing, and I'm going to hand it off to Tim.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Thanks everybody for joining us here today. It's wonderful to have 200 plus people in this conversation. And, Chris, thanks for doing such a great job of summarizing the work that you've done with our staff on identifying these sites and the opportunities that exist in them across the region. I do encourage folks to go check out that website when they have a chance, maybe during our Q&A, because you might miss some really awesome answers. I also just want to, remind folks that that's a regional analysis we did based on data sets that are available all across the region. So we've got to rely on assessor data. We've got to rely on information from CoStar, or various other sources. We didn't really have the time or the bandwidth to dive into every site and evaluate its feasibility site by site. So there may be some that you look at and say, hey, that's never going to work. That's actually something totally different. Let us know what those are. We're not arguing we've got 100% right. We're not arguing that 100% of these sites are really good for development, but rather what we're trying to do is sort of create a map and a data set that can help to spur a conversation in communities, because that's really what we want to do. And that's why it's so great that there's so many folks who are here from city and town government in Massachusetts and across, or from MAPC and across Massachusetts. And I'm sure a lot of them, looking at the fantastic examples that June shared, that she's dug up over the years, are wondering, well, could something like that even fly in my community? And people are, understandably all over, folks are concerned about change. They're concerned about aesthetic change in their community. They're concerned about financial impacts. They're concerned about cultural changes in a variety of different ways. And so my question for June is sort of what are some of the messages or outreach techniques that you felt have been really meaningful and useful in actually trying to get communities to be open to such transformation of these sites that have existed and are kind of the way people think of their communities, right? And it's hard for them to think about it in such a transformational way. So what are some of the approaches and messaging and framing that you've found to be successful in the examples that you've studied across the country?
Well, that's an excellent question. I think it is the key question. When we talk about retrofitting, one of the things we're very careful to try and navigate away from is to say it's all or nothing. It's this or that. It's urban or suburban. That there's a whole spectrum of things, and that it's really about diversifying the mix so that a whole range of desires and needs can be met and satisfied. So we have a lot of detached housing, the conventional suburban, neighborhoods already existing. So that's not really what's at play here or what's at stake. And we have these demographic changes. So folks might want to think, well, maybe it's not what they want if they're thinking about what to approve or resist in their own communities. But what about when they're older, or their parents or their children who can't afford to live in the same lifestyle that they might, or the same type of housing that they were brought up in, but they might not want that. different desires emerge in younger generations. So these kinds of commercial properties are really ideal for diversifying the mix without having to replace the places that are doing just fine. So downsizing within community and adding more housing types. I think one of the things too that we try and talk about is the emergence or approach of the role of design, right? So it's not either a detached house or a big apartment building. There's a whole lot of stuff in between for which you can achieve pretty high densities with a kind of low-rise character, and fast, skilled designers can have it fit in and be made compatible with existing landscapes. So this is the so-called missing middle, which brings in a whole new set of housing types. And if they can be developed in a large enough kind of increment, but designed very carefully, they can be quite compatible, and you can achieve the desirable densities, I think, and new mixes. So those are the kinds of things that we certainly try and talk about to deflect a kind of either or set of arguments, or a zero-sum set of arguments that come up, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
And I think one of the other things that we talk about is, all suburbs are not the same. So if there's a place that's already has vacant businesses, that is losing market share, then there's a tax, penalty to be paid and so forth. So it's not about bringing back something that used to exist.
Mhm.
It's about how do we move forward and reinvigorate those places. I think the third argument we talk about that might address some of this is that the larger retrofitting project isn't just densification everywhere. It's about a redistribution of density. So redirecting densification to corridors and nodes where transit is, and that could be paired. Some of these strip centers could be regreened, like that example in Connecticut. So some might have more housing, mixed use near transit, and others, especially if they were built on wetlands or other kinds of things, could be demolished in a way that could improve the value and care for the adjacent properties, as well as, of course, watershed management and all the rest.
Because they'll be serving as green infrastructure that could mitigate flooding and so forth on adjacent properties. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, that example it was a Connecticut example, right? Where that's it. So what you're suggesting is a real sort of asset focused argument, right? Rather than that's where we kind of have to start, is why do we need this diversity? How could it contribute and make things better, while we're also sort of addressing some of the concerns? And
Yeah,
David, I'm sure you heard a lot of concerns from folks in Woburn, from city councilors and from residents and so forth. I guess, how did, maybe could you talk a little bit more about, some of the biggest concerns that you heard from stakeholders in moving this project forward, and kind of how you were able to address some of those?
I think, frankly, Woburn was pretty receptive. I think that they really started the vision with, MAPC's help to try to figure out how they want to push 40R, and then working with Edens when they bought the mall. I think it takes that kind of leadership to get something like that project done. No one's going to listen to me, frankly, coming in, and it really, a municipality isn't going to. Maybe some local leaders that have some vision about these types of projects will, with a developer, but in some instances, if there's not local vision for it, it's very, very difficult to get done, especially when it's a zoning overlay. You may need a 2/3 vote. With housing choice, you only need a majority vote now. If you need to go to a town meeting, that adds a whole nother level of complexity. So I would say on the scale of permitting pushback, Woburn was more in line with maybe some of the other municipalities I've worked in. I won't name them, but you always hear the same things with housing. It's always traffic, school-aged children, but I think it's all subtext for, this isn't the community I bought a house in, and things are changing in a way that I'm not totally comfortable with. So I think you hear, and then there are some legitimate, obviously, concerns in that area. I mean, if you have school capacity issues, you have school capacity issues. I understand that, but a lot of times there's subtext that I think we've all heard, through our professional endeavors. What I would say is, traffic always, but you can generally mitigate that with these projects. The traffic from a retail center is very intense. So if you're taking retail and making it mixed use, I think also the peaks are different. So if you have a mix of uses, it's distributed traffic versus huge peaks or an office park, for example. If you're going to densify an office park, I mean, in the before times, of course, but where everyone shows up at 8:30 and everyone leaves at 5:15. There are real traffic impacts for a development like that. Whereas if you have a mix of uses, it's going to be more distributed. And housing really doesn't have a huge traffic impact. It's hard to convince people of that, but in general, for all the traffic studies I've done, they're really not a big issue.
Yeah, and this, and I guess maybe just talk. I mean, you were able to use a by right permitting process, so you didn't necessarily need to go for the rezoning as you had the process as you.
Well, Avalon and Edens worked with the city and MAPC to come up with the overlay district that we then used. So there was the plan that you saw, the perspective rendering was developed prior to the zoning being
Yeah.
approved. So
Right.
I do think, and I think it's fair to have this, municipalities do want to understand if they're going to pass an overlay, generally what it's going to look like.
Right.
I think while, certainly developers would love it if, we just did huge overlays for big districts, I think that there can be unintended consequences. So I think requiring some level of specificity for a specific site, I think sort of protects everyone, knows everyone what they're getting into. You can't promise every single detail, but you can be directionally correct. And if you build a trust, a relationship of trust with everybody else, then you usually can get there
Great.
and build a product everyone's proud of.
Yeah, I want to come back to that point, but actually Chris was, really involved in a lot of the engagement around the adoption of that 40R and so forth. And I'm wondering, maybe Chris, what did you hear from some of those, from some of the stakeholders in Woburn? And there's a good question from in the chat. Did you get any pushback on the overlay as an example of spot zoning? What was the tenor of that conversation like?
I was, I think it was overall, the whole process, I think, was quite collaborative. Certainly there was what I think was a vocal minority of people who were concerned about the concerns that David has mentioned about impacts, especially about traffic. I think in terms of this question about spot zoning, no, that didn't come up. I mean, one thing to keep in mind, this is a 23-acre site. I mean, this is bigger than a lot of our suburbs downtowns. This is a large area. And it actually, the types of uses was very similar to just north of that site. They have an overlay district. That's a mixed use overlay district, not a 40R. But the uses and the densities were fairly similar to that as well. So I think it worked out quite well with that. I think overall, in terms of the process, certainly with these different stakeholders, it wasn't sort of 100% agreement at all times. And I think that's okay. I think, in the end, we got what is maybe not a perfect product by any one stakeholder's perspective, but then this goes to, again, to June's earlier comment about not letting perfect be the enemy of the good, I think, or the great, actually. I think overall, this was something that I think the city, is happy with. Certainly MAPC is happy with a lot of that. And I assume the developers are as well.
Yeah, I just had one point to that. I think process matters. I think that the fact that Woburn did this the way they did with process to have stakeholders come in before, Chris had a session at, I think it was a school where people came and chose what their goals were. People came in and provided feedback. I think that even if you end up with a resident comes out with an outcome that they don't really like, if they feel like the process was fair, you generally have a better leg to stand on.
Great. June?
Yeah, I just first I just wanted to compliment you on the project, and we do have a case study of in the new book of another Eden's project, Mosaic District.
We did that one too with them.
I guess larger, right? But very similar. The question I wanted to ask, I know there were some questions in the chat, and you did address it about it was sort of a hybrid project, right? The half, you kind of split the center in half, sliced through it, which I think Ellen and I as urban designers and architects like to talk about some specific tactics that we've pulled out from the case studies. And I seriously see two of the tactics there. One is to kind of break up into smaller blocks or split up the site so that you can have this more interconnectivity and networks. Then that also can have more social space potentially in terms of, third places at the strip mall where people might be able to go and socialize, and the park gives that too. But then you have this kind of bifurcation where one side got extensively kind of redeveloped and the other side is really a more re-inhabitation and a kind of facelift, right? And you still have the parking lots, you mentioned that. This relates to another tactic we talk about, which is anticipatory retrofitting. And I don't know if you explicitly did that, but when you have the parking lots, you think about the parking lanes, how you organize the parking so that those could be future streets, where you put the utilities, not just sort of the path of least resistance diagonally across the site, if you have the opportunity to do that, but already place them into what would be a future street. So then you see those parking lots as potential future infill retrofitting sites, in the future, potentially. So layering that into the site planning on some of these, even if it's not, realizable at the outset, there's a plan in mind for 10, 20, 30 years down the line, potentially. I don't know if you did that explicitly.
Yeah, no, we definitely kept our options open. I think that, market basket, the constraints on these projects are real, as you
Yes.
noted, and you need to address those. So, as you said, the perfect can't be the enemy of the good here. To get really, it's a bit of a tale of two sites. That said, you get to keep market basket in place. You get to relocate some of the larger tenants in one area, concentrate that, and then create some walkability. I saw a question in the chat about the walkability, single story retail, and so on. I think that, we picked our spots, right? You take half of the site and you say, we're going to create a open space and walkability and all of the features that you would see MAPC or ULI type of design guideline book, and use that on one side. And then the other side, you sort of acknowledge that you're not going to constrain future development there. But, the one thing that I will say and Chris probably remembers this, when Market Basket, we talked about Market Basket redevelopment of the site, when the first question was, is Market Basket going away? And when we said no, it wasn't, there was applause in the audience. So there are stakeholders that really like some of these existing uses, and you have to acknowledge that and respect that as well.
So that's a great point, David. I think, June, I was going to, I think your example about breaking it up into smaller blocks and this kind of incremental approach, I think that's a useful tactic, I think, for some of the other questions that came up in the chat, which is like, why were there so many pad buildings and why is there still so much parking? Because, we're moving towards a more mixed use walkable area, but, you have to kind of do it incrementally. And that over time, then those pads, maybe those could be redeveloped into taller buildings and so forth. So you sort of have to have a long strategy on this. I think one of the questions I have for you, June, is a lot of the examples. I haven't seen the new book, I have to admit, but some of the other examples that I've seen of yours tend to be really big districts, right? You get big national developers in, and you can really rework, the hydrology of the site, and you can kind of create, really critical mass of units. A lot of the sites that we identified, and we did score them kind of based on their capacity. So, we tended to favor some of the larger ones, but some of the ones that scored well tend to be smaller sites and somewhat isolated. And I guess, what advice do you have for us as regional planners or municipalities who are looking at this when they say, hey, look, there's a real opportunity here, but this is kind of a small site. It's only 2 acres and it's kind of isolated. Like, should they move forward with that? Should they or should they not, in favor of areas that are kind of have a bigger opportunity? Or are there some specific design principles that you think are really useful there?
I think, overall, it's an all of the above framework, right? So each site is different. When people ask us to generalize, we just can't. We might have built out a lot of these suburban areas in the 20th century, the late 20th century, according to sort of formulas when you had the green fields and it was kind of open, and you would sort of start by reproducing formulas about malls, about developments, and so on. But then they each mature and evolve in their own way. So the retrofitting strategy for any particular opportunity site should be specific and customized. I think our framework, and sometimes people see the big redevelopments as the main argument. Of course, those are highly imageable examples, but the whole range of the smaller examples are down to just a single big box store that might be turned from retail to a community serving gym, or a preschool, or a library, are just as important, I think, especially when you think about that larger incremental metropolitanism that each contributes and will add up to this larger, contributing to this larger project. And I think the strip malls are an incredible opportunity because there are thousands and thousands and thousands of them, and with different owners. Many of them have been, a lot of the value has been extracted out of them over many, many decades. And so you have a kind of dwindling income stream, perhaps, and they've been superseded by other developments nearby. So I think there's tremendous opportunity in these smaller sites that, as you've noted, are scattered in almost every community has one or a few, whereas within a metropolitan area, the major regional and super regional malls are fewer, right?
I think that's going to be a big question for a lot of communities, because as Chris mentioned, we have this new, there's a new requirement that MBTA district communities provide zoning by right for multifamily housing. And in a lot of cases, there could be some of these, small, somewhat isolated sites close to their transit stop, which could have a, be good potential sites for rezoning to help fulfill those requirements. I do think that gets, I want to get over to the zoning, go back a little bit to the zoning issue, because a couple questions came up in the chat, and Jesse answered Ann's question about what Chapter 40R is, and it's important to note that 40R requires, the 40R statute, which provides municipalities with a $10,000 incentive per unit to rezone for housing, also requires them to allow it by right. That is, no special permits or discretionary process. The new MBTA zoning requirement also requires those zones to be as of right. And I guess, David, my question for you is, as a developer, when you're sort of looking around and you're to how important is it to you that you're seeing districts where you can develop as of right versus districts where you're getting clear messaging from the leadership of the municipality about sort of what their vision is? It sounds like in this case, it wasn't necessarily, I mean, it was as of right at the end, but you worked with them on that zoning. Mm-hmm. So how do you think about that, and how important is that as of right zoning to you when you're looking for opportunities?
I mean, as of right zoning is great. The right as of right zoning is great. I think that as of right zoning that has a lot of prescriptive constraints makes it actually more challenging than working through a special permit process that has some more general guidelines, to be honest. I saw some questions about single story retail. I think ground floor retail is great in the right location, and I think it can be really problematic for a successful development in other locations. So we need to be very careful about that. It's very expensive to build. The retail that's integrated into our building at Suburban is twice as expensive to build as a freestanding pad. You have to consider things like the fact that their HVAC for the retail that's integrated into our building needs to go 5 stories up through a shaft versus the ceiling heights don't align. There are a whole lot of technical complications to integrating uses. So the fact that if you can do more multiple use sites, I think the Hingham Shipyard is another great example that we were involved in, where you have housing and retail that are close and walkable but not integrated, actually gives you a higher likelihood of actually being successful in making a economically viable project. So that would be my point on that. So I would say as of right zoning is great if it's flexible enough that you can work with the municipality to come up with something that economically feasible. Also, but line of sight is fine too. Like if there's a special permit and you can get in the room and talk through what the goals are and deliver on it, that's not a constraint from my point of view. Mm-hmm. The biggest issue is appeal risk. I think that's the biggest thing that we think about sometimes when it comes to special permit projects versus site plan approval projects is not, you've worked everything with the municipality, you've got the votes, but then someone within 300 feet ties you up for 3 years appealing a special permit. And that's reality. But that is a risk that we think about.
Well, that's why, I mean, there were one other important, there are a lot of important changes made with the housing choices law that was adopted a year ago. One is this multifamily requirement. One is, David, as you mentioned, the reduction from a 2/3 to a simple majority for a lot of housing changes. And the other relates to meritless abutter appeals. And so I do think made some changes on all those over the course of the last month. I realize it's already 3:40. There's a couple things that came in. One is somebody asked about examples of good examples like visualizing density. I immediately thought of the Lincoln Institute book. I guess it came out probably more than 10 years ago, called Visualizing Density, which is a great example. June, do you have any other examples? Or maybe if you want to just put them in the chat, if there's others that come to mind.
That's the best one in many ways, but we do try and have the missing middle too, I think is helpful
Okay.
in that regard.
Yeah.
And there's a book on that from Island Press, I think.
Great. And we're working at MAPC to try to compile some of those images as well. Jim Barrows had a question about whether this might be useful for other gateway cities outside the MAPC region. Of course, as June has showed, we can see these examples all across the country. And so there's no reason that this couldn't be applicable outside of MAPC. And I'm sure I know there's folks from the other RPAs who are on the call today and will be sharing this information with them as well. And, I think there were a couple other questions about public-private collaboration and support. I think David spoke to those pretty well about sort of the partnership and the vision. 40R, the smart growth zoning district, that's really important because that is a funding component. That does provide funding incentive payments for municipalities to adopt that zoning. And there's another law called Chapter 40S, which will reimburse communities for any unrecovered education expenses associated with 40R developments. So there are some good backstops that are there where the state is really trying to provide more certainty and financial security for communities for whom that may be one of the concerns. Now, we've also found that 40S hasn't really been utilized because, as it turns out, most of those communities, most of these new developments end up paying for themselves, education included. So, but it's good to have that sort of insurance policy for communities. So we're closing in on 3:45. I don't think we can address any of the other questions in here, but I would encourage folks to go check out the site. Maybe Sasha can drop the link in the chat once again so folks don't have to scroll up and they can get it there. Just want to thank Chris, Caitlin, Kimberly, Ryan, everybody on my team and throughout the land use department for working on this report. June and David, thank you so much for being here. This initiative is part of our regional planning process, or regional plan, Metro Common 2050. It's one of the products that we wanted to produce to help communities figure out how they could play a role in building a more sustainable and equitable region. So it's really a resource. It's one resource. There's more work to do. MAPC, Chris, and others are always available to help with technical assistance. And actually, let's get down into the nitty gritty and look at these sites and figure out what might work and write the zoning for it. Metro Common has a lot of other things that address a lot of other issues. If you'd like to learn more, you can visit metrocommon.org. If you'd like us to, someone from staff to come and talk to your Board of Selectmen or your planning board, city council, and so forth, please get in touch with us. There's a survey link that Sasha just dropped in the chat where you can identify if you'd like to have someone from MAPC come to present at a meeting. That's the link that Sasha just put in there. And you can also email the project manager, Eric Hove, and he can coordinate that with you. So we'll be working on a lot of different fronts to implement that plan. This is one of them. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. It's been a great participation, fabulous questions. I'm really sorry we couldn't get to them all, but I feel like we really got some great insight from June and David. Thanks so much for taking the time to be here today. Chris, thanks for the great presentation. And I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.